Okay. Well, okay again. This paper deals with one of the problems that's always been fundamental to social science, which is the question of stability. And in particular, it deals with the question of stability in the distribution of resources. Now, in modern liberal democracies, this question has taken the form of why don't the poor expropriate the rich? And I'll return to that a bit later on. But in terms of the themes of the conference, the paper covers two dichotomies. One is the dichotomy between social science and economics. And certainly from talking to a lot of the excellent young scholars here, there is some concern about how economics can somehow be broadened and somehow get away from its standards assumptions. The other dichotomy it deals with is the dichotomy between democracy and egalitarianism, and the sort of underlying assumption that democratic regimes should somehow produce reasonably egalitarian results. Now, I'm going to divide the paper up into four sections. In the first section, I'll explain what the problem is, and that's important because I'll claim just about everyone's got it wrong for the last 300 years. Secondly, I'll produce a model that allows us to give a fairly rigorous, in the way formal models do, way of interpreting the problem and also getting some results out that actually allow us to move away from a lot of the fairly ad hoc approaches that have been used in sociology and political science, depending on concepts like happiness and legitimacy and so on. In the third section, I'll wave my hands at the analysis. I've only got 20 minutes, so there's not going to be much analysis going on. And in the fourth section, I'll discuss the results. Okay. Well, the problem. The problem of stability in liberal democracies and distribution goes roughly like this. What you observe in nearly all liberal democracies is that you get a distribution of wealth. We start with person 0 here, end up with n here. You get a distribution of wealth that roughly looks like that. Now, the question that's really concerned political economists for about the last 300 years, I mean, it turns up Burke's worried about it, the founding fathers of the American Constitution are worried about it, it turns up in the Madison Papers, Bentham's worried about it, Schumpeter's worried about it, Hayek's worried about it, John Stuart Mill's worried about it. They all say, well, given this distribution of wealth and we've got a democracy, let's say there's some winning coalition, let's just assume it's a half, n over 2 plus 1. Why don't the poor form a coalition to change the distribution of wealth? It becomes a standard problem. So in a sense, if you like, the default setting is a setting in which this coalition is formed and wealth has been distributed according to whatever that coalition can do, whatever that is. Now, in an attempt to answer this question, you basically get almost the invention of sociology. So the answers go along the lines, people aren't doing this, something's got to be distorting their preferences, therefore, and then you get mass media, dominant ideology, the content of TV programs, et cetera, and there's also a structural dependency literature that tries to do something about the threat of capital moving out. If you think about the question for a little bit, you don't have to think about it for too long, but actually it just doesn't make any sense. It actually doesn't make any sense at all. Remember, the problem is if we've got democracy, we've got a perfect democracy, the poor will form a coalition to expropriate the rich, and so we've got to design our constitution to try and block this, or it's a good reason for not allowing the poor to vote. But let's say this coalition of n over 2 plus 1 forms in order to change the distribution. Well, the obvious thing is that for these guys, simply to buy a voter from here, I don't know, for some sum of money, 10 million, doesn't matter, 100 million, and form a majority coalition, and then they become the winning coalition, and they can expropriate whatever the poor have got. Of course, the obvious response is to buy one of these guys back, and so on. So really, if you start with the notion that you've got a democracy in the sort of abstract sense of a pure market, if you've got some sort of pure democracy when any coalition can form, then essentially that's the sort of problem you're looking at. And you could tell a story to motivate this. You could say, well, some political entrepreneur forms a political party and goes through the phone book. I say, look, if you guys vote with me, you're in over 2+1, we can expropriate these guys. Roberto forms another coalition and gives one of you guys a better offer, and on it goes. So the question really only makes sense in that context, and the question then becomes, what sort of distributions are likely to be stable under a condition in which any possible or any permissible coalition can form? Now, I'm not the first to have actually noticed this. Not many people have noticed it, but some have. Tulloch noticed it some years ago, and also a mathematical economist by the name of Ullman noticed it. One or two others have too. Putterman did, I think Ward did. And in all cases, well, actually, to be fair to Tulloch and Ullman, they said, this is a problem. We don't know what to do about this. Some people have said, well, this wouldn't happen because if this were allowable, then the system would descend into some sort of chaos, so the political parties or political entrepreneurs would apply some sort of self-denying ordinance that they're not going to do it. Well, of course, that's nuts. Why would you do that? Why would you do that? If you don't want to form this coalition, I will, and I'll win. And you don't see a lot of restraint from what I've seen of American elections lately, a lot of restraint in electioneering. So it just doesn't make any sense. Well, what we need as political economists or formal modelists is some way of looking at this. And this brings me to the first dichotomy I talked about. Essentially, your model has got to have a political choice component because you're dealing with power, but because you're dealing with distribution of assets, you're dealing with distribution of wealth, it's also got to have an economic component. It's also got to have an economic component. Clearly, the way in which wealth is distributed is going to affect production. It's going to affect what there is to produce. And the question becomes, as I said, the question becomes in this context, what distribution would have the characteristic that it wouldn't be possible for any other coalition to form and change the distribution and make its members better off. And this, I argue, would be the default setting for discussing democracy, and not a situation where this coalition of the poor forms and expropriates the rich. In addition, you might want to ask some other questions about the stable distribution. Would it be egalitarian? Under what conditions would it be egalitarian? Under what conditions would it exist, etc., etc. Okay. So how would we go about solving that sort of thing? What sort of model could we construct? Well, what I've done is to use something from cooperative game theory called the theory of the core. This has a number of interesting, and I'll show you how this works, but it has a number of interesting attributes. One is that a stable core, or if a payoff in the set of the core exists, then it's also Nash. You can't do any better than get that payoff. So there's no problem with incompatibility with optimizing individuals if you want to think of the problem that way, but I'm not thinking of it that way. The second advantage of the core is that for very large player games, although this is a finite set, in this particular case I'm looking at a finite set. Infinite player games get a lot more complicated. For very large finite games, we have a lot of good theories about the core. We can get some mathematical purchase on it. There are other things that are slightly more attractive, amongst those being von Neumann, Morgenstern stable sets. They're just much more difficult to deal with. You get a little bit more attractability, and you lose a vast amount of ability to do anything with it. Okay, I'm aware I'm on a very strict deadline, so let's just tell you what things would look like. So you'd say a coalition, which is a set. S, we would say, is a coalition of voters. Coalition of voters. What else do we need? We need some decision rule. So the size of S would be a number M, and we would say that a coalition is winning if M were greater than, that's not very good, were greater than some number Z. So that's a pretty straightforward way to get some index of political power. We'd have a wealth distribution, which would be a vector. So W would equal wealth for individual 1, wealth for individual 2, wealth for individual N. We'd have that, and we'd need a production function. And we just have a standard production function, which we define as, the function's defined as the number, N is just the number of individuals, and W is the total amount of wealth. All wealth is productive, is the total amount of wealth. And that gives us our two components of the model. Now, in order to analyze this, what you need is some measure of the value of coalitions. And so you need a function, it's called a value function, we'll call it V, such that S maps into R. That is not necessarily unique, but you've got a value function for all possible coalitions. And this in the literature, by the way, is called the characteristic function, which isn't the same as the characteristic function in mathematics, the 0, 1 function. What else do we need? Well, we can cache this in using the bits we've got. What we're really interested in is the value of the coalition S when it forms against the value, because remember what we're doing, we're forming a coalition to alter the distribution of wealth. So if you guys form a coalition, in a sense, you're looking at your value against your complement, and clearly the complement that's going to be expropriated is not necessarily going to be very happy. So what we do with that is we say the value of a coalition, V of S, is going to be some function of, let's call this M of S, the number of members of the coalition. That's their workforce, and the total amount of wealth they can control. What's the total amount of wealth they can control? So W of S, clearly they've got their own wealth. So everyone in S has got its own wealth, plus whatever you can get from the other guys. So then you've got all the wealth you can get from the other guys. WJ, J, not a member of S. That should be a J. Now, clearly, the other guys aren't going to be too happy about you taking their wealth, and they're going to make all sorts of threats. They're going to threaten to burn it. They're going to threaten to destroy it. They're going to threaten to do all sorts of things. Remember, these coalitions are jockeying for position. You can see it as a sort of a standard electoral trade-off between these political entrepreneurs. I say, well, you join my coalition, we'll do this. You guys say, you dare do this, and we'll do that. So all sorts of things about credible threats and so on fit in that aren't modelled, but you'd want to adjust this with a parameter, which I called B in the paper, where sort of B, I guess B lives in 0, 1, and B is the amount that can be expropriated. B is the amount that can be expropriated. Maybe you could block all expropriation, maybe you can block some, or whatever. Okay, main results. Remember, theory of the core I should give you. So when does the core exist? Well, the core is an allocation. It's an allocation. So remember what we're looking for. We're looking for an allocation that's stable against another political entrepreneur setting up and offering people a better deal. So it's a distribution of goods. And the conditions for the core to exist, that's probably I'll do better, say 1, are that the amount that you offer everybody, so we're going to say that the core is a vector, is a vector A, and that's going to equal an allocation to individual 1, an allocation to individual 2, etc., to individual n. The amount you can offer everybody in a coalition S must be greater than or equal to what they could get by themselves. If it wasn't, then they'd go and form that coalition. Secondly, it must be the case that the amount you can offer everybody is feasible. So N is the all-player coalition. Don't like that at all. It must be the case that the amount offered to everyone has got to be less than or equal to what the all-player coalition can produce. If you set these equal, then you get the condition for stability. That is, there is a distribution that has the property such that no coalition can form and do any better for its members, so the whole system's stable. Now, set at equality, this doesn't mean that this distribution's unique. This distribution might be a set. This distribution might be a set. So, you know, the core might be, it could be any number of distributions in some space, and there's a lot of technical stuff in the paper showing that the core's got a Lebesgue measure greater than 0 under certain conditions. It's an n-1 dimensional manifold, etc., etc., etc. The normal sort of stuff that you would expect. I'll give myself 5 more minutes and just present the results. So what do we get out of this? Well, fortunately, I'm able to use something called the Bondareva-Shapley theorem, which gives a very good general theorem for the conditions under which the core exists and constructs some sort of function which maps into the measure of the core. And out of that, I can get a number of results, which I'll just very quickly summarize. Firstly, the core is non-empty if the marginal productivity of every individual in the society is increasing. If the marginal productivity is decreasing, you still may have a core, but the production function needs to be homogeneous of some degree greater than or equal to 0, and the amount that can be appropriated must be small. So what does that mean in terms of social science? It translates into the idea that a society is likely to be stable if every individual is reasonably productive. Highly productive societies, or at least in terms of labour, are likely to be stable. A society is likely to be stable if individuals aren't so productive, if you can't expropriate too much. Paradoxically, that doesn't mean a society would be stable if you can't expropriate anything. If individual productivity is so low, even if you can't expropriate anything, the society becomes unstable. What else quickly? A really interesting question, given where we started, would be under what conditions would the egalitarian distribution be in the core, and under what conditions would it be unique? So let's say this is the egalitarian distribution. It turns out that the egalitarian distribution is in the core if and only if, the egalitarian, it's a sufficient condition, is in the core if individuals are sufficiently productive. And it also turns out that if you increase the number required to make a majority, or the proportion of the space required to make a majority, then you could start off with an egalitarian distribution in the core and you could squeeze it out of the core. So somewhat perversely and contrary to what we might normally believe, an increase in the weight of the political system, that is an increase in the number of agents required to make up a majority, doesn't lead to an egalitarian distribution and may in fact squeeze it out. What else? I can also show the conditions under which what you can do by altering the productivity of it. There are 2 things I want to alter. It turns out that the productivity of capital doesn't matter. If you disaggregate the production function, maybe treat it as a Cobb-Douglas function. What really matters is B, the amount you can expropriate, your power to expropriate, and the productivity of labour. Now, it turns out that by altering as you might expect, by altering B and alpha, if alpha is the productivity of labour, by altering these two parameters, what you can do is progressively shrink the core. What you can do is you can just keep shrinking the core. And it turns out that you can shrink the core such that the core is uniquely, this is not the only unique solution, but you can shrink the core such that the core is uniquely the egalitarian solution, and that happens exactly at the point where the marginal product of labour is constant, and where, probably less surprisingly, you can expropriate everything. Okay, let me just now make a few remarks because my allocated time is pretty much run out. What have we done? Well, by using this approach, we've got some fresh insights into one of the fundamental problems of social science and political economy. This is the problem of stability and the problem of distribution. You'll note we can give conditions for stability which have got nothing to do with the standard literature on legitimacy and happiness and so on. The initial distribution will matter in this, but I haven't got time really to talk about it very much. But we can give conditions that really depend on at least a much more formalised architecture, and some of them are consistent with the literature on stability, such as Adam Jaworski's study that links stability to high per capita income, which might be a proxy for individual productivity. What else? We can show that an increase in the size of minimal winning coalitions doesn't really do anything for egalitarianism. It may even make the situation worse. We can also show, in an extension of this model, I've just assumed, although people have different wealth, that labour is more or less homogeneous. We can also start to work with a situation where some people are very big producers or essential for the production function. That has the maybe expected, maybe unexpected, I don't know what your intuitions are, but it has the consequence of actually stabilising the system. That is, the core is larger and it exists under a larger amount of conditions. Now, a fairly obvious, I guess, standard neoclassical economics type response to this might be, you haven't taken into account incentive effects. Well, I haven't done so for a number of reasons. One is, as Peter suggested yesterday or the day before, I don't think incentive effects are all that important. Secondly, if you wanted to take into account incentive effects, you could take them into account with the parameter B, that is the value of wealth, if there are any incentive effects. But for those two reasons, I haven't taken them in separately, and I would need a lot of persuasion in order to put them into the model. What's the upshot of it? Well, just to repeat, the upshot of it is I think the guys who have been talking about this for the last few hundred years have actually got it wrong. The problem is not what they think it is. The problem is quite different, and that your default setting, if you're looking at distribution in democracy, would be the distribution that's stable under the conditions that any coalition can form. Okay, thank you very much. That's me. Yeah, we'll of course run on to about 1:15.
Yes, great. And how do I just flip them right there? Okay. Okay, great. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks a lot for being here, and thanks for the organizers for putting this event together. What I want to address today is the conference theme of false dichotomies by looking at the concept of credit. Now, credit might not be the most intuitive vehicle for understanding dichotomies, because credit, by its very nature, is first and foremost a vehicle for connecting and transcending boundaries, distances, and time. And it connects rather than separates. Because credit is fundamentally based on the imagination, expectations, fantasies, and fictions. Credit has the amazing capacity to link the future to the present, distant geographies to the local, and the upper echelons of the social hierarchy to the very lowest. However, even though credit connects seemingly distant phenomena, it connects them in such ways that highlight certain qualities and hides and ignores others. This means, for example, that when we talk about emerging markets, they are always cast in a certain way, often highlighting the positive features of the link between the periphery and the core of the empire, past or present. Or when we talk about subprime lending, Wall Street frequently frames its relationship to Poor Street in a manner that suggests mutual benefits. In my talk here today, I want to focus on the way in which credit forges ties across space, time, and class, but that it does so in a way that creates false dichotomies. I call this notion credit fetishism, and it's something I develop in much greater detail in my book, Casualties of Credit. My work brings us back to London at the turn of the 18th century and the English financial revolution. This is a moment when the modern financial architecture was in the process of formation. Long-term public credit was being developed, active trade in equity and debt instrument was generalized, and there's also a circulating credit currency that was now moving across the English landscape. This change also coincided with important political changes, most noteworthy the Glorious Revolution that gave real power over the purse to Parliament, and also the rise of a two-party system, the Whigs and Tories, who battle each other on all kinds of different issues. England was during the time also engaged in a very expensive war with Louis XIV France, and therefore the ability to borrow was of course key to any kind of successful nation building or successful empire building. This is one of the reasons why the Bank of England was created in 1694. All of these financial and political developments transformed the culture of credit in England at the time. The relationship between public debtors and creditors was no longer based upon the king's personal relationship to few wealthy, often noble lenders. But public credit was now a contract between Parliament and an amorphous and anonymous public. It was therefore public opinion of parliaments, and in particular the ministry's capacity and, quite importantly, willingness to manage the public debt, that dictated the status of public credit, i.e. both the price of bonds and therefore also, of course, the interest rate. This meant that important political decisions were now dictated or circumscribed by the bond market, which spatially was located in Exchange Alley, and the surrounding coffee shops in Jonathan's and Garraway's. These places, and here's a picture of Exchange Alley, and it was surrounded by these coffee houses. Here's an example of Jonathan's coffee house, but Garraway's coffee house was another space in which these bonds and equities were traded. Now, these are places of misinformation, in many cases, active misinformation. This is the place where the stock jobbers were trying to manipulate information for their own benefit. These are the places where rumors were planted for various reasons. And this is also, and this is what I want to focus on today, where political propagandists went to work trying to frame and shape public opinion in a way that led people to trade their bonds and stocks in a way that promoted political interest. The party in control of the ministry would use propaganda to try to bolster public credit so that interest rate remained low, and that would facilitate their political agenda. The other party would, of course, try to sink public credit and therefore force a ministerial shift. This meant that the government policies were criticized, often the prospects of their revenues were doubted, and the ability to service the debt was questioned in this space. England's new financial architecture worked well from 1694 with the creation of the Bank of England to about 1710 when the War of Spanish Succession was truly testing its limit. A serious financial crisis developed in 1710 with bond prices plummeting and which reduced the ministry's capacity to borrow further to finance the war. The Prime Minister, Robert Harley, at this point realized that he needed a radical solution, and that solution was the South Sea Company. Now, you've certainly heard stories about the panic and mania surrounding the South Sea bubble. I'm not so interested in that here, but I'm more interested in the early years of the South Sea Company, which was a device to save and solve the English public debt system. So the South Sea Company was given the right to create a little bit less than 10 million pounds of capital stock. They wouldn't sell these shares to the public for cash, but they would sell it in response or in return for bonds, deeply discounted government bonds. The government committed to paying the South Sea Company a 6% interest per year, but most importantly, gave the company the Asiento contract, which England had won in the War of Spanish Succession. The Asiento contract was the contract to supply Spanish America with African slaves. So this is essentially then a debt for equity swap, and instead of relying only on future tax revenues to service the debt, the government would use a monopoly contract on trade of slaves in order to bolster people's expectations of future revenues. So by eliminating the alien government bonds from the market, the state would once again be able to borrow on more favorable terms. And of course here, the whole scheme therefore relied on people favorably imagining the Atlantic slave trade. By imaginary here, I'm thinking in terms of a collective vision, perception, and understanding of a world that very few people could observe. Harley's propaganda ministry went to work trying to ensure that the public visualized the transatlantic slave economy as an inexhaustible fountain of riches. And of course, the Whig counterpart went to work trying to undermine confidence and in the kind of favorable construction of an imaginary of this world, and try to question the company's financial and commercial parameters. So let me just give you a couple of flavors of how this debate ranged. One of Harley's propagandists and foremost propagandists was the soon-to-become famous novelist Daniel Defoe. He celebrated the accomplishment of the South Sea Company, writing in September of 1711 that the bringing so great an undertaking so near perfection in so short a time may well be reckoned among the wonders of Her Majesty's glorious reign. In another pamphlet often credited or attributed to Defoe, the author jubilantly stated that Mr. Harley's proposal of providing effectually for the payment of the public debts of the nation and of establishing a trade to the South Seas of America has filled the hearts of all good subjects with joy. And bringing with optimism, this author continued, the provisions made for the payment of the national debt cannot but produce a lasting credit, and an establishment of a South Sea trade must tend exceedingly to the good of all the degrees and ranks of men among us. The poor will be more employed in manufactures, the product of the estates of our landed men will become more valuable, and the trading part of the nations will greatly be encouraged. Others focus more directly on the benefit of the slave trade. Herman Mull, for example, another prominent propagandist, suggested, quote, the greatest trade and the most beneficial the English have ever had with the Spaniards on the continent was for Negroes, end of quote. The Whigs soon replied to the Tories' effort to bolster confidence in the South Sea scheme. One author queried, quote, whether giving a fund of interest upon debt and then subjugating the whole to a hazardous and unlikely adventure may be properly called securing our debts, or whether it may not more properly be called putting us into a regular course of losing both principal and interest. Continuing to heap suspicion, he said, whether erecting a company and appointing a stock to trade to a place actually in possession of our enemies, and of which we see no prospects of dispossessing them, does not incorporate the proprietors into the spectators' worthy society of castle builders. Again, he added, whether a voyage to the South Sea and a voyage to the world in the moon are not founded upon the same phenomena of probabilities. The company had a shaky start, during which this propaganda war intensified. But after 2 years of ironing out commercial, diplomatic, and geopolitical problems, they embarked on a prosperous trade in African captives. The South Sea Company stock traded up, and the public credit crisis had been averted. So by tying the public debt to the profits from the Atlantic slave trade, a closer mental association was forged between the urban milieu of London, the slave forts on the African coast, and the colonial towns of New Spain. This sophisticated time-space compression transferred value from the future to the present, from the sphere of commerce to public finance, and from the Atlantic world to the city of London. The fact that the South Sea Company succeeded in restoring public credit suggests that the investing public judged the company's prospects favorably enough. The propaganda writers had shaped an imaginary that focused primarily on the commercial opportunities, while downplaying risks, challenges, and obstacles. The almost complete silence about the conditions and experiences of the African captives extended to the public debates surrounding the South Sea Company. Now, it's far from surprising that the human conditions of this trade was ignored at this moment, decades before the early abolitionist movement was formed. But what is remarkable is that one of the biggest risk factors facing the company, the agency, the resistance, the mortality of the slaves, right, was completely ignored. Death from violence, overwork, and disease was, of course, part of the course in the Atlantic world of slavery. And it would have made sense for the pamphlets writing in opposition to the company, who frequently warned about other types of risk facing the company and its commercial prospects, to mention the frequent death from disease, suicides, and self-mutilation, as well as rebellions. While the downplaying of risk would have been in the interest of the company, the fact that the opposition did not exploit this risk factor in their attacks revealed the extent to which the African captives' agency, subjectivity, and humanity were left out of the British imagination and imaginary of the Atlantic world. Although this imaginary provided a fairly broad and inclusive image of the Atlantic slave trade, and here I argue that because they're both proponents and opponents of these schemes, it was nevertheless based on a selective description of reality. The practice of abstraction was not something new to early modern Londoners who had plenty of experience with the marriage market, the insurance industry, indentured servitude, and the labor market. Now, Karl Marx, of course, famously described the commodity form abstracting from people's essential characteristics and qualities, calling this phenomena commodity fetishism and money fetishism. He argued that capitalism, in appearing as a mass of commodities mediated by money, tends to obfuscate and hide its own underlying social reality. The resulting fetishism allows people to engage in market exchange and consumption without recognizing the capitalist mode of production and its alienation and violence. So, for example, in the coffee shop, an early modern Londoner could purchase a cup of sweetened tea or coffee for a silver coin without ever considering the social conditions within which silver, coffee, sugar, and tea were produced. Now, the abstraction, and here I'm heading to a close, the abstraction or fetishism facilitated by credit differs in important ways from that which Marx ascribed to money. If money allows people to disregard the origins of value, credit, on the other hand, necessitates a careful construction of a social imaginary of the reality within which future values will be produced. Money frees people from thinking about the past conditions of production, while credit necessitates that the future conditions are carefully considered and vividly imagined. In other words, money and credit enable different practices of abstraction and different kinds of fetishisms. This means that if the process of construction of that means that if in the process of constructing a social imaginary, particular features of the underlying social conditions are excluded, it is a more deliberate act of admission than just not paying attention or disregarding those very conditions. This is not to suggest that credit fetishism originates in a conscious or conspiratorial attempt to conceal important facts. Instead, the social imaginary of credit reveals what members of society find important, as well as what they disregard, even after careful deliberation and consideration. It is a form of unwilled or built-in blindness grounded in a particular understanding of the world. The fact that the debates surrounding the South Sea Company ignored the agency of the slaves and humanity of slaves meant that the humanness and rebelliousness of the slaves did not even enter into the minds of the public. In denying the captives agency and capacity for violence, one of the few remaining aspects that instilled fear and respect in the Europeans, and that was the only recognition of their humanity, the Africans were stripped of their last claim of this humanity, leaving them as mere bodies capable of hard work and suitable to the climate. The South Sea Company episode is just one of many examples of how investing publics exist within social imaginaries based on heavily manicured versions of reality. I therefore welcome the call made by INET to start looking carefully at false dichotomies and how they are constructed. False dichotomies are not just theoretical problems, they're crucial political problems as well. Thank you very much.
So one of you tell me when I have 2 minutes to go, and then I'll do a summary. So this is a piece about trying to see the relationships between Buddhism and economics. And Adam Smith, and the title stands for really contemporary economics. Sometimes Adam Smith, but in today's talk, it's just contemporary economics. And the Buddha is really about contemporary Zen Buddhism. And in the first part, which is probably all I'll have time for today, I try to interpret Buddhism as a rational way of thinking and see what kind of messages it has for economic theory. That means I'm leaving all kinds of parts of Buddhism out that are not necessarily irrational, but that are not, they're somehow in a different way of thinking. And then in the second part, which I might get to a little bit, I'll see that economics can be useful for understanding Buddhism also. So there's not much previous work by economists. What there is very famous, so Schumacher's book, Small is Beautiful. But the chapter on Buddhism there is really, as he said later, it could have been any religion. Serge Christophe Combe's Le Bonheur et Liberté is very, very good. And if you read French, which I don't, but I hired a student to read it for me and tell me what it was about, and it's a very good book. But there is a lot of work by philosophers, people in religious studies programs, sociologists, architects, and so on, taking a kind of a rational approach to Buddhism. So I'm almost alone among economists, but I'm not alone among people trying to do this. So what might the Buddha, that is, what does Buddhism have to say to economics? Well, in many respects, somewhat surprisingly, Buddhism is like economics. For one thing, it's exactly the same as the economic point of view, in that the central question in Buddhism is human happiness, or the relief of human suffering. And so something is a good thing in Buddhism if it makes you happier, and if it doesn't, then it's not a good thing for you. That's the only criterion. There's no God, there's no higher morality, there's only you and your personal happiness and feelings of freedom. Buddhism is also very individualistic, like economics. And Buddhism, like economics, is empirical. The only judge of whether it works or not is you, and the time that you judge as to whether it's worked or not is now. It is not in the hereafter. And there's one other point, which is that Buddhism, which is not on this slide, is Buddhism is almost more freedom-oriented than economic theory. On the other hand, obviously there are many ways in which Buddhism is not like economics. The most obvious and the most profound of these is that in Buddhism, and this was the central insight of Gautama, the Buddha, lying under the Bodhi tree, he realized that desires are just like addictions. Buying more goods will never satisfy them. All it does is feed the cravings, then you want more and more and more. the only way to cope with them is to try and reduce the cravings themselves. So in that sense, Buddhism is the exact opposite of economics. And what you have to do is extinguish desire. And the key to this is, the way they often put it, is to extinguish yourself, to lose yourself. And literally what that means is that that's not that hard to do, because the self that you have is really impermanent and fleeting. It's not what you think it is. And it takes me pages in the paper to explain this, but if you look at this photograph, it says better than anything else, I think, what that means. So this is Times Square, and this is one of the photographs of the South Korean photographer Atta Kim. As you know, Times Square is always teeming with activity. There's thousands of people there running around, shopping, and doing everything else. Just let the camera run for 8 hours, you see, on that spot, and you see what's left, which is basically nothing. So the Buddhist is the same. He takes the camera and turns it inside, and as you know, your mind is always full of these thoughts and ideas and what to do next and so on, imaginings. But over a long period of time, what you see is that really there's not much there. Not much has been happening over the last 8 hours. So that's nothing from something. There's also something from nothing. As you know, in contemporary physics, the universe is something from nothing. Vertical particles appear from nothing and disappear, and the entire universe is, in a sense, a free lunch. So it looks like the world is, as Wittgenstein put it, neither a something nor a nothing either. Here's everything. That's the best map we know of the entire cosmos simulation. And the best way to understand Buddhism is to use this joke that I first heard told by Anthony Downs when he was president of the Public Choice Society. What did the Dalai Lama say to the hot dog vendor? Make me one with everything. Now, it's not that simple. You can't get to nirvana by eating hot dogs, but nevertheless, what you can do is identify with something, and the place that most North Americans first heard about Buddhism was in the classic book, the novel by Pirsig called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And he talks about how when you're just involved in fixing his bike, which he does in half the book, and there's no distinction between himself, the activity of fixing the bike, and the bicycle. He's just not conscious of anything. He's merging with the bike, and that had a huge impact in North America. But you can, there's other ways of losing yourself. For many people, when they're reading a book, they suddenly realize that for the last hour, they've been so involved in the book that they've just not thought about themselves at all. And that's when the book is best. And Jeff Bezos, the head of Amazon, when he was designing the Kindle, said, that was my goal. That's what I wanted. I wanted the machine to just disappear. And you wouldn't even think about the thing you're looking at. You just absorbed in the book. And as you know, because we're all writers, it's the same thing there. When you're writing and suddenly you kind of lose consciousness of the fact that you're writing, and the writing just flows and you're kind of one with whatever you're doing, that's usually when you like it best. So we're all familiar with these experiences of losing yourself in small ways, even though none of us, or at least I am not a Buddhist, and I don't know any Buddhists. You can also become one with other people, and I could go on from the 8th century poet Sandeva, but why do that when we have Gary Becker, the economist, who has formalized the concept of oneness in economics, and there you have it. So the income of the head of the family is the family's income, and the head is one with the family in Becker. And as you know, also the kid, even though he's selfish and doesn't care about the family, is also one with the family. In the precise economic sense that suppose either the head or the kid could make $5 at the cost of his father losing 10, he wouldn't do it because he realized the family income falls. So we have oneness in economics, not just in Buddhism. And okay, so let's get to some action. I can't see that well, so I'll read it up to you. A man Traveling across a field, encountered a tiger. He fled, the tiger after him. Coming to a precipice, he caught hold of the root of a wild vine, and swung himself down over the edge. The tiger sniffed at him from above. Trembling, the man looked down to where far below another tiger was waiting to eat him. Only the vine sustained him. 2 mice, one white and one black, began to eat away at the vine. The man saw a luscious strawberry near him. Holding the vine with one hand, he grasps the strawberry and eats it and says, "Delicious." Okay? In other words, he totally, even though he's about to die, right, he's totally focused on the present moment. And he thinks of nothing else. There's more to it than that. It's sometimes called no mind, which has other interpretations, but the Buddhist interpretation of this concept is without mind. And the idea is that if you think of about a really skilled basketball player making a shot, he's not thinking about how to do the shot, he just does it, right? So that's what's being talked about. And you can try and identify with, you can be looking at the water, as in this quotation, and you can try and identify with the stream, but then there's a dichotomy between you and the stream, and so really, at the end of the quotation there, strictly speaking, it's not the case that one becomes the water and flows on as the water flows on, no more, no less. So another way of putting it might be this, which is that in Buddhism, all dichotomies are false, including the statement I just made. Mindfulness is not enough, so you can be totally in the present. You can also be one with your environment, but there's one more thing, it's got to be harmonious. You can be one with your environment when you're drowning in water, but that's not the idea. It's got to be a harmonious thing. So what are the implications of this, which I take to be the core of Zen Buddhism, and the core of Buddhism itself is this idea of losing yourself and becoming one with other things. It sounds a little crazy, but what I'm trying to do is suggest that in one way or another, these things happen to you all the time. You just never put this label on it before. For me, it happens when I'm doing woodworking. For other people, it may happen in different activities and so on. And usually, for me at least, that's when I'm happiest, when I'm working on the wood and I'm not thinking of anything, or I'm writing something and I don't think, I just feel calm, peaceful, and happy. And I think for most people, that's when they're happiest, are those experiences. And if that's true, let's suppose that is true, which is the Buddhist point of view, then that kind of explains why ordinary consumption is so unsatisfying. So you go and you buy something and you think that's going to do it for you, but it doesn't. So, and more, aggrandizing the ego, that is trying to gratify yourself instead of losing yourself by accumulating more and more and more wealth, so you have more and more and more things, in a way just distances you from other people. So in the last election campaign in the US, you saw how distant Romney was from typical Americans in terms of his way of thinking. The richer you are, the more distant you're going to be from them, and the harder it'll be to relate or identify with them. And it distances you from the objects of consumption themselves, because they become the things that you have as opposed to your kind of bonding with them. And so, in short, you can't buy nirvana. How do you get there? Well, there's a very complex and structured program which involves meditation and koans and the Noble Eightfold Path. I'm going to talk only about koans here. How much time have I got? 2 minutes.
5.
All right. So initially the term was Kang-an. It means a Chinese public case in medieval Chinese jurisprudence. It meant literally the bench of a magistrate. And the term koan was adopted to try and make the authority of the idea comparable to the legal authority of the magistrate. There are 2 interpretations of koans in the literature. One is, which is very popular, and especially by, for example, Suzuki, the main popularizer of Zen in the West, takes this interpretation, that fundamentally at bottom they're meaningless. And the idea is to make you focus on this thing that really you can't solve with your intellect. You try and try and try, and the Roshi, the teacher in the monastery, says, solve it. work on it, think about it, and come back with a good interpretation. So you work on it and work on it and work on it, but your mind can't solve it because the thing is, in some fundamental way paradoxical. And then eventually something happens to your brain and other deeper parts of your body take over. The other interpretation is that they have a rational interpretation, and that's the path I'm going to follow, obviously. And essentially what I'm going to suggest that usually you can solve it by seeing how it helps you to see, in a poetic way, the one and the many and the one, or how, and it helps you to become one with your environment. So the classic example of the koan is, what is the sound of one hand clapping? There are obviously many others. Here's one. So once Shan came to visit Master Lung Tan, asking for instructions, and stayed there till the night settled in. Tan said, the night is advanced, why don't you retire and repose? Shan made a deep bow, lifted the blind, and went out. But it was all darkness outside. He came back and told the master that it was utterly dark out there. Tan lit a candle and handed it to him. Shan was about to take it when all of a sudden Tan blew the light out. On the spot, Shan attained enlightenment. Why? Well, using a candle divides the world into two, the light and the dark. But if you're enlightened, you don't need a candle to see. Here's another one. At Zen Master's Nansen's place, one day the monks of the East and West halls were arguing over a cat. Seeing this, Nansen held up the cat, saying, if you can say a word, I won't cut it in two. The assembly made no response. Nansen cut the cat in half. Okay? The assembly is divided. They're two. They're not one. Nansen is the leader of the monastery. He has to confront the problem directly to save the community from itself. He says to them, in effect, if you can be one, I won't cut the cat in two. Possibly both sides love the cat. They certainly don't want to see the cat killed, but they can't unite, so he cuts the cat in two. Are there now two cats? No. For the cat to live, it has to be one. Same thing for the assembly. All right, let's go quickly to the most famous one, the sound of one hand clapping. I tell this in the context of the story of little Toyo, who was 12 years old and wanted to do koans. And the master says that he's too young, but the boy insists, so he says, okay, and he gives them the sound of one hand. He says, you can hear the sound of two hands when they clap together. Now, show me the sound of one hand. And the boy retires and retreats in the way that you do in the monastery to think about this. And he hears the sound of the geishas, and he thinks that's it. And he goes back and tells the master, and the master says, no, no, no. So then he hears the cry of an owl. The master says, no. The sound of one hand was not the locust. For more than 10 times he visited Mokurai with different sounds, all were wrong. Finally, he entered true meditation and transcended all sounds. And he said, later, I could collect no more, so I reached the soundless sound. He reached the sound of one hand. Since popularized in this composition by the American composer John Cage called 4 minutes and 33 seconds. Here it is performed in Barbican Hall, London. When they announced that it was going to be performed, a huge crowd wanted to go and see it. It was initially performed in New York City. Cage himself performed it on the piano. That is, he sat in front of the piano and for 4 minutes and 33 seconds played exactly nothing. So you can listen to it now, even though it's just a screenshot. But that's only one interpretation, and I'll close with this. There's many other interpretations possible. The koan is invented in the 17th century by Hakuin, and he says something that's closer to what I want to say, in a way. He says, when the sound of the single hand enters the ear to even the slightest degree, and then he goes on, and he says, in other words, all sounds existing in this world are heard without exception. So you hear everything. This agrees with the framework I've suggested. In the framework I've suggested, the sound of one hand clapping is the sound of the universe clapping. Everyone and everything in the universe are clapping. The universe is one. Can you hear it? If you start listening, the sound can be deafening. So, everything and nothing. The sound of one hand clapping is both silence and the loudest sound imaginable. I'll stop there. That's the second part, but we'll do that some other time.
Yeah, thank you. I'm John Smithin from York University. I'd like to return to the concept of emptiness or nothingness in Buddhism, which you alluded to, and it's my big problem with it, actually, because I would say that they're like a contrasting view in a realist social ontology is that there are, there are social things, social constructs that are not certainly reducible to the physical or biological. Speech acts, for example, but nonetheless are real, you know, in the sense that they have deontic power and causal effects on our lives. I mean, if I draw an imaginary boundary between you on that side of the room and me on this side, and we agree not to cross it, it's not there, there's nothing physical there. On the other hand, it's something, because you're sitting over there and I'm sitting over here. Of course, we can also break it. If I step over into your space, you know, the whole social structure crumbles or disappears. But how is that type of vision reconcilable with this concept of emptiness or nothingness?
Oh, I see. I'm not quite sure what you're saying, but because in this whole area about emptiness and nothingness, there's a lot of times I'm not sure what's being said. Emptiness, on the one hand, is nothing, but on the other hand is also everything, right? And it turns out the Buddhists, in a sense, are not wrong in terms of contemporary physics. If you crossed over the street to the Perimeter Institute there, this is kind of exactly the way they think. Most of the universe is empty. And so a typical Buddhist painting, for example, or Chan paintings, of which I had a slide but didn't use it, is there's the enormous landscape. It's called the painting of birds. But there are these tiny little birds, tiny, tiny, tiny. Most of the painting, you just see the clouds, the sky, everything else. But the subject is literally, and that's to say that's your natural place in the environment, but the whole thing is empty. But is there nothing there? Well, in one sense, yes, but on the other hand, everything is there. So I don't know if that helps you, but I tried to allude to this as best I could.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is probably emergentism of some kind, you know, something from nothing as you...
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
One more question?
I'm Matt Panhans from the Young Scholars, and I have a question for Alex and a question for Carl. Alex, I think this cooperative game theory can be very useful for the political analysis. My question, though, is it seems like there is an information issue. If we assume that voting is anonymous, that buying the one vote is not so straightforward, and maybe you would have your coalition, you're not completely certain who's in it. And then, Carl, I think it's very convincing that finance reflects society's values, and I'm wondering if you've thought about that for kind of the current crises and current finance. Which values does that reveal about our current society?
Okay, well, it's really at the level of the abstraction of the pure market. What I could do, for example, is go through the phone book and publish a list of N over 2 plus 1, or whatever the minimal winning coalition is, and say, if you guys vote for me, we win. If any one of you doesn't, we don't. So it's simply a perfect information, and certainly it's no less abstract or no less plausible than the sort of assumptions that go into general equilibrium theory. But generally speaking, I think that's a much more realistic framework for dealing with the whole issue of distribution in liberal capitalism, and a framework that gives a lot more interesting results than the standard one of just assuming somehow magically a coalition of the poor in over 2+1 against the rich has some sort of privilege.
Thank you very much for your question. It's a hard one to answer in 1 or 2 minutes. But I guess I would suggest that there's a kind of worldview that emerges around the time of the financial revolution, that it's not only about finance, it's about how the way the world operates and what values become important. It's a worldview in which most of life is seen from the merchant's point of view. Most of the relevant input is fitted into a kind of balance sheet approach to life. It's a worldview in which spirituality, non-economic factors in general are kind of disappearing and fading into the background, and the only thing we tend to see is, of course, that which has an immediate pertinence for economic relations, and more so aspects that might lead to profitable investment. So there becomes a kind of bias towards people wearing economic lenses and perhaps not recognizing other aspects that are also important to our life, such as power and many other themes. So that's a very quick answer to your question. Thanks.
Just a quick question for Ronald. What do you think are the implications of Buddhism for the way we understand and conceive development and development strategies? So the way we understand development and development strategies. What is the implications of the work you're doing? And so I'm interested in your view of how Buddhism can enlighten, if you want, the strategies of development.
It's a good question. I haven't thought about it as much as I would, as I plan to. One thing that comes right away is that this concept that's now gaining force in all over Europe and North America about the environment, subsumed under the idea, should trees have rights, in the famous article and in the book by Christopher Stone. There's a recent case of a pit bull in Georgia that bit a 5-year-old child, actually partly paralyzed the child's face. And they were going to put the animal down, and the head of the Supreme Court in Georgia immediately ordered that the dog be given a lawyer. So just to make sure that he had his rights, and his case could be heard, and the lawyer would stand for him. The same thing for trees and so on. So this is one thing that comes right out of Buddhism. And in Bhutan, you know, they have this concept to some degree, and Jeffrey Sachs keeps going and talking about Bhutan and saying this is the way of the future. First of all, in terms of the protecting the environment, and secondly, in terms of the concepts of gross national happiness, which they've embraced. And so Bhutan is trying to develop in a different way. I don't know how Buddhist it really is, but Sachs seems to think that it certainly wants to be Buddhist. The problem I have with it is it's kind of a dictatorship, and so I'm always leery of these things, but they're trying to push things in this way. And so this is one concept that you don't simply try and accumulate. Because in Buddhism, it doesn't really work. And so I'm always amazed, in a way, at the emphasis on growth. 30, 40 years ago, when I started studying economics, maybe longer, we all thought that the emphasis on growth would disappear. And I remember Harry Johnson writing an essay at that time saying growth is not really an objective. You know. So now we're all so wealthy, it's unimaginable, and yet we still have to grow. And everyone talks, and the entire dialogue is constructed in terms of this. Well, Buddhism is not about that. Buddhism is the opposite. In the best story I know, where there's a monk living in a kind of a farm, and the guy comes to see him, and he's going to serve him tea, and he realizes he doesn't have another cup, so he goes into the yard, and there's a skull lying there that he takes and goes and washes it off a bit, pours the tea into the cup, and hands him the tea in the skull. The guy says, that's not a cup, it's horrible. He says, well, how can you be so oriented towards things? It doesn't matter what it is. So, I mean, the objective of Buddhism is not economic growth. So in that sense, maybe it doesn't apply if you still believe in economic growth. But certainly in the modern world where everybody's talking about the limits that are coming and destruction of the environment, it seems to me Buddhism is more pertinent than ever.